Welcome to Coruzant Technologies, home of the Digital Executive Podcast.
Welcome to the Digital Executive. Today's guest is Joe Vezzani, a tech disruptor, Web3 entrepreneur, and investor based in California. Joe Vezzani is the CEO and co-founder of LunarCrush, the platform transforming the transparency and cutting-edge analysis of social media intelligence and market insight. Under Joe's leadership, LunarCrush has revolutionized the digital ecosystem, leading the cryptocurrency realm and applying its real-time data as crucially valuable intelligence for marketing, advertising, and a range of industries. LunarCrush has achieved recognition as a top 200 website, earning coveted placements and trust from renowned industry leaders such as TradingView, Coinbase, and Kraken. In his role as CEO, Joe champions LunarCrush's growth with hands-on leadership and mentorship, fostering a rewarding company culture with an environment of innovation and development. Well, good afternoon, Joe. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Brian. How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I appreciate you jumping on, man. I'm hailing out of Orange County, one of my old stomping grounds, as we talked about, but just really appreciate you making the time. 2-hour difference here to Kansas City. But again, just so ecstatic to get into what you do here with your company. So I'm jumping directly into your first question. Joe, can you share the journey that led you to co-found LunarCrush? And what was the initial spark or problem you wanted to solve in the crypto realm that led to the birth of LunarCrush anyway?
Sure. Yeah. I think, when you're an entrepreneur, you're just constantly thinking about what it is that you're going to take on. And, for me, it's always been about, throwing myself into some sort of arena, that maybe I was not, the most in-depth at and, the best at, and trying to learn about that. And, when I came across, Bitcoin, it was actually my co-founder, John, at the time we were working together, and he came up to me. He's like, "Hey man," he's like, "Do you have any Bitcoin?" And I was like, "What is that?" And so, this was like January of 2015, and, got a little bit of Bitcoin. I think I got my first Bitcoin at like $200. I think I might've sold that one at like 175 or something. So it took a loss in my first Bitcoin trade, but just kind of fell down the rabbit hole, and we fell down it together, and just always were ideating around the industry and what, this kind of decentralized world and, what it meant that they solved the double spend problem, of money on the internet, and why that was such a big deal, and that this entire economy was going to be built on top of, just that kind of, spark that they created, and that Satoshi created with the Bitcoin white paper. And, at the time, even Bitcoin is 5 years old, and so for us, it was, like Ethereum came out in 2017 or 2016, but for us, 2017 is really when we started thinking really heavily about it. Was, wow, you're going to, the world is going to be built on top of, this tokenization of everything. And if everything can have a token, how does that disrupt new businesses? How does that disrupt fundraising? How does that, disrupt, globalization of, assets? And, we started to go all over, social media looking for, how to invest in these things, and, which ones were undervalued. And what we found was not a lot of information. And it was all about, the price of this thing versus the price of the other thing. And so for us, we were like, hey, how do we potentially aggregate all of like the social media data that corresponds to all of these individual cryptocurrencies? And some of these things are being mentioned 10,000 times a day on social media. And, if you're just looking at your one feed yourself, you might see 500 posts a day if you're a pretty like rabid ingester of social media. And, all of those things might not be about cryptocurrency. And so we said, wow, the retail consumer is really not seeing the whole picture. And so for us, that's kind of how we went down the rabbit hole of, let's get all this data. Let's see if we can help make sense of it for ourselves. And then that kind of turned into, well, let's create a website and let's create an app that people can use and kind of democratize the opportunity for this alternative data set for cryptocurrencies. And institutions have been doing this, for a long time for the regular stock market. They have data feeds from places like Twitter, and, they're looking at, all sorts of little nuggets of data and trying to find insights. And they have entire teams that they've stood up in order to get this data down. And they, spend a lot of money to do so. At LunarCrush, we charge $8 a month, for a tool that's just as powerful, if not much more powerful than what a lot of these institutions have. And so that's kind of, how we went down that rabbit hole. It's like, pretty quick from, getting out there, figuring out that, okay, this industry is going to be something very, very big and we need to be a part of it. And then let's go build something, that we think makes sense in it.
That's awesome. Love the stories. And that's what I love the most about the podcast is getting to hear these awesome stories of how people started and now they've brought something into the world that's going to make the world a better place. Really do love that. And we're, like I said, Joe, earlier, we are heavily involved in Web3, DeFi all the way for the people. So I appreciate that. And Joe, LunarCrush has been described as a transformative platform for social media intelligence and market insight in the digital ecosystem. Can you elaborate on how LunarCrush leverages real-time data to serve its users and how this aligns with your vision for the company's impact on the crypto industry?
So, real-time data is ultra important for trading, for investors, for people that are, that they have a portfolio that they're managing. It's also important for, a passive investor. If you find out that, Silicon Valley Bank, has issued some stock and has some very negative sentiment, and we can deliver you an insight that, gets you out ahead of something like that. You could potentially protect against, some pretty serious downsides. And on the inverse of that, if we can deliver you a nugget of information about something that you've not heard of and it's early, then, maybe we can get you in a little bit earlier than the rest of the world into, some of the best investments that potentially are out there. So for us, how do we get, all this data in real time and how do we make sense of that data? When we're pulling down, tens of millions of posts across the internet and crawling the internet for news and all that information every single hour, we have to take all that data, we have to turn it into insights and intelligence and analysis. And so you spend a lot of time, looking through and sorting what is very messy data. Sometimes some of our customers will come to us and, they'll say like, oh man, I'm getting, there's a lot of spam in some of this stuff. And like we clean all the data that we have for as much spam as we can. And we say, you know what, there's a lot of spam out on the internet. And, you have to, you're basically trying to always stay one step ahead of what's out there. And, if there's a large community of people that are out there trying to sway the intelligence of the market one way, it means that it's very valuable data that's out there. And so, for us, it's trying to take all this data, make it very simple so that, the average investor could come log in to LunarCrush and, very quickly, kind of understand where the markets sit from a social perspective, and this is cryptocurrencies, this is stocks. We also carry, all the different NFTs that are out there. And then we also actually have other categories that we've created at LunarCrush. And this includes all like different sports like the NFL, the NBA, La Liga, if you're a soccer fan or a football fan, depending on where you are in the world. And, we have marketers and, different people that are, part of these brands also looking at LunarCrush, trying to understand, hey, who are the influencers that are making an impact on my business? And, who is, should I contact those people? Or, if you're an influencer, hey, where do I rank, in the social sphere, for influencers when it comes to, these different cryptocurrency projects or even something like a Nike, right? And how do I kind of get the attention of those brands? And so for us, we're just trying to kind of take all of this data and distill a little intelligence from the noise that's out there. And, I think that's why a lot of our customers and a lot of people over the years have liked what we've done at LunarCrush is because we've just stayed very true to disseminating social information and really going deep on social. Because a lot of people, it's difficult and they don't want to go there.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And there is a lot of work, obviously, to scrape the internet on real-time basis, essentially, and filter out a lot of the stuff that's out there. I can only imagine what type of processes are involved in that. But I appreciate you breaking that down for us and bringing us the latest and greatest information as quickly as you can. So, Joe, what are some of the most innovative features or projects that LunarCrush has developed under your leadership? And additionally, what challenges did you face in implementing these innovations and how did you overcome them?
I mean, I've been here since the beginning, so I've been at the helm, since day one. And I would say, when it comes to startup, you're just trying to figure something out until something works. And, if you're an entrepreneur out there and you're like, oh, I don't have the idea yet, right? Like it's like you almost don't even need the idea. You just need a direction to start working down and you just need to start trying things. And so it's almost like you just kind of create the mission right? And so for us, it's just creating transparency on the internet. And then, you just kind of work backwards from there and say, well, how do I best do that? Right. And where are the markets that you can monetize early on to kind of create the thing that you want to create? I always kind of give the example of, someone like Elon, he probably always wanted his car company, and spaceship company, but he started with, PayPal and other things earlier than that, because that's kind of what the market was receptive to and within his capabilities. And so for us, I kind of think of it around the same realm of, hey, we're going to create all sorts of cool things. And it started with, creating transparency for cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and stocks. And now it's, creating transparency across, 32 different categories and, having an API for developers that they can come build on. We've got some pretty big customers in the industry like a Coinbase and Kraken, and starting to work with TradingView as well, which is a huge charting software to integrate LunarCrush data. And another big thing that we're growing is something called LunarCrush Earn. And so I'm super excited about. And it just went live 2 weeks ago. And, it's creating transparency for brands and creators. And, since we are out there looking at all the different creators across these different social media networks, we know exactly how many interactions they drive and who interacts with the post that they put out there. And we know the kind of the consistency and what categories and topics that they're posting under. And so, we've created a really cool tool. It's really simple. And, a brand can come in and they can pay in crypto, but they can also just, pay in fiat. They can pay with their credit card. They don't have to interact with cryptocurrency, and they can create campaigns where, basically they say, hey, I want, say, you're Brian, I want to, grow my podcast. You could put whatever you want into the box for all these creators to post about. And, right now, social media campaigns, it's like if you're going to go hire like a Kim Kardashian, it's like an awareness campaign. It's like a billboard, right? It's not a performance campaign where, attribution and how many installs that you're getting or how many visits or how many signups. So it's very, it's very kind of awareness and, I guess I would say like more broad-based driven than it is like, looking at all of the data that's coming down. And so we wanted to kind of marry those things up and bridge the gap between kind of the creator and the brand. And so these brands are coming in and they're, putting budgets up, and then, lo and behold, they're finding out that there's all these creators out there that, are in kind of the micro influencer. Maybe they've got a couple thousand followers, maybe they have 30,000 followers, and now they're posting about their brand. And so it's something really exciting that we're pushing at LunarCrush that we just launched. And so, I'm very proud of this product because it is a venture that I would say is, adjacent to what we're all already doing. But, it's basically, we say, hey, the thing that we do really, really well is that we pull data and we pull it at scale and we organize that in a clean fashion. And then, you can build anything you want on top of social media data. And so this is something exciting that we're really proud of.
That's awesome. And of course, obviously you've seen a lot of your creativity, the iterations starting there day one and seeing this thing really grow into this very innovative platform that more and more people are adopting. So appreciate the share. And Joe, last question of the evening here, given your extensive experience, how do you see the Web3 and cryptocurrency sectors evolving in the next few years? Are there any trends or technologies on the horizon that you think will significantly impact the industry?
Yeah, I mean, we're at a very interesting moment in history in our industry here in crypto and Web3. We came into 2024 with a bang with the Bitcoin ETF being approved. And we've seen, institutional interest in what's going on. And that's huge. Looking back at 2015, I mean, like, my God, that news would just, it blows your mind to think about that. But, that was a decade. It's almost been a decade since for me joining and understanding about Bitcoin. So it's, back at that time, you're thinking, oh, maybe 10 years from now. And then you're thinking, wow, that 10 years, that's such a long time. But here we are. And, I can't imagine the news that's going to hit 10 years from now. And, it's going to come quick. And so, it's I think a monumental year for Bitcoin. And I think then, the rest of the market's trying to understand, well, what does that mean for the rest of the industry? It's kind of like Bitcoin has got the OK seal, I guess, by the government and by Wall Street. And so now it's kind of like a race to see who else can make that happen in one breath. And then in the other, staying true to kind of this mantra of decentralization and, how important it is, to, have things that are transparent out there. And that's kind of the reason that these blockchains, I think are like, we kind of say like Bitcoin's like a truth machine and a freedom machine because it's transparent and you can build on top of these things. And so I think that the most exciting thing that I've seen this year is this kind of Bitcoin renaissance of building on Bitcoin. And you're seeing different layer twos come to light where, whether they have kind of a proof of transfer where they're kind of settling on the Bitcoin blockchain, or they've got some other mechanism that's kind of tied to Bitcoin, or, they're developing directly on top of Bitcoin, like Runes that was just launched at the halving, where you can actually launch a token on top of Bitcoin directly on the Bitcoin blockchain, or ordinals where you can inscribe an NFT or some sort of data onto the Bitcoin blockchain. And I think that these things are really exciting because at the end of the day, we're all kind of Bitcoiners in the industry, no matter how many things I think people are working on. I think, you have to be a Bitcoiner in your heart of hearts. And so if there's this opportunity now to do all the things that maybe you were doing on other chains on Bitcoin, and you can do that at scale, it's like kind of like, why wouldn't you do that? And so I think that's where a lot of the industry is starting to look. And, if we could, sometimes I would always say in the industry, it's almost like we're too entrepreneurial. Everyone's launching something different every other day. I think I just saw a stat today where it was like 1 million tokens or something were launched, or meme tokens were launched in the last 5 months. And it's like, what's the impact to that? And so I think, pretty interesting stuff is coming down the pike. And it's, I think there's never been a better time. And I always say this, to be in the industry and building.
I love that. And I really do appreciate the enthusiasm. We can hear it in your voice this evening, but for the DeFi community and building upon this. And again, love giving power back to the people. As you know, a lot of corporations and government have their hands in everything. And I really do appreciate your insights, your perspectives, and all the great things you're doing out there. So again, I really do appreciate it, Joe. And it was certainly a pleasure having you on this evening. And I look forward to speaking with you real soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Bye for now.